Hi again. I'm very happy to see you for this session. Today's chapter focuses primarily on risk management. As part of future information security manager, this is a very important task. If you remember in our previous chapter, you have looked at how you actually introduce certain policy, and this policy is there to actually protect your asset. So apart from the other activity in securing the asset that you want to protect, you need to also identify first and foremost what are the risks involved. Remember from your previous exercises, you have identified the asset that you want to protect. And this asset comes with certain vulnerabilities and also certain threat that could come upon it. And from those threat and also vulnerabilities, there comes certain risks that could happen to that asset that you want to protect. So this is the purpose of this chapter. How do you actually try to manage those risks that you have identified, and what are the activities involved in risk management? So by the end of today's session, first and foremost, you can define risk management, what is it, and what is the role of risk management in any organization which involve protecting your information asset. Secondly, of course, you can use risk management technique to properly prioritize which risks need to focus on first in protecting your information asset. And third, you can assess risk based on the likelihood that it could happen and the effect it has on your organization. And of course, fourth is properly document the result of the risk identification activities. Okay, so without further ado, let's follow the lecture for today. So any risk management activity will involve two major processes. First is the risk identification and the risk assessment. Secondly, of course, is the risk control activity. Simply put, risk identification and assessment is where you identify what could be the main risk or what could be the risk that could contribute to the demise of your asset. And then once you list out those risks, you properly give it certain marks and prioritize it according to how does it will impact your asset. Second activity is, of course, you need to identify proper control based on the risk that you have identified. So let's say you have the risk of theft. So what will be the proper control in order to protect your asset from theft? So you identify the risk, and then secondly identify what could be the proper control to rectify or protect your asset from that risk. So in any risk management process, usually it will involve three separate group of people. First of all is the management and the users. The management and the users, for example, you need to get their input in terms of getting the ball rolling. So usually from the users, you identify what could be the contributing factor to the risk actually happening. And if those risks actually happen, do you have the proper people which will handle the risk that will come to that information asset that you want to protect? Secondly, of course, in terms of management support, you need to get their support in terms of getting the proper resources and support to actually implement your security control in terms of protecting the asset from the risk that you have identified. Secondly is the IT group. This is the group that will build and secure the system that you want to actually protect. So these are the technical people that you need to be involved in your risk management process. Third is the information security group. This is usually the leadership role in addressing the risk. Of course, you need this expertise in doing the proper risk management and risk assessment. And then you need to have this one to convince the management and also help manage the IT people in securing your information asset and managing those risks. So you have the management group, the IT group, and the information security group in this risk management process. First and foremost in the risk management process is the risk identification process. So this is a very initial activity that you must perform in any risk management process. You need to identify what are the risks which actually cause threat to your information asset. So this activity, first of all, include the plan and organizing of processes, create system component categories, develop inventory of assets, identify those threats, specify vulnerable threat, assign value to the asset that you actually want to protect, assess likelihood of vulnerabilities, and then calculate the risk factor for the asset, and of course, you review possible control that protect the asset from the risk, and then of course, lastly, you have proper documentation. Simply put, the activity, first of all, which involve asset identification, and then each of those assets, what will be the possible threat that could actually causes harm to your asset that you want to protect. And then from there, you assign the value to those assets. Means that from those assets that you have listed, which have proper ranking in the prioritizing of your focus. So for example, perhaps your first and foremost focus will be perhaps your IP. And then secondly, perhaps will be your hardware and software. And then third, perhaps would be your people. Okay, this is just an example. So you need to have your proper team to identify what are your assets and what are the priority of the asset that you want to protect. And from there, you identify also the risk which will be related to those assets that you have prioritized. And usually, there are a number of assets that also have certain number of threat related to it. The same thing, give proper ranking to the threat with related to the asset that you want to protect, and then you assess the likelihood for the vulnerabilities that could contribute to the loophole or weaknesses of the asset, and then calculated the risk factor based on the uh, probability of the threat that could also come from the vulnerability that you have identified. And lastly, you review possible control that could protect your asset from the threat and vulnerability that you have listed. And lastly, you document and properly have a proper information gathered around you so you can actually bring them to the management to assess the situation and have proper risk management activity in the end of the day. So it will involve asset identification, threat identification, and also vulnerability identification. From there, you can have the proper risk identification process in the very beginning. Okay, just remember this diagram. Okay, usually risk management will involve asset, threat, and vulnerability identification from the very beginning before you actually begin the actual activity. So this is where you must have your proper team from the very beginning, because this will be a very tedious task to do, and you must have a proper team to begin with. So I repeat again, any activity in risk assessment, it will begin from the asset. Identify what you hold dear to the organization, what are the information asset, what will be the process involved in obtaining the information asset. So this is the first part, identifying what you hold dear to your organization, the asset. So this activity of asset identification must involve the management, because whatever you deem worthy or perhaps worth of protecting must come from the management, because they are the one actually funding or having the resources to buying those assets that you want to protect, or perhaps they know, okay, in the organization, in their business, what will be the most precious information asset that they want to protect. So you classify this asset into useful groups. Perhaps you have information asset, perhaps you have hardware and software asset, perhaps you have IP assets. So you group these assets into proper category and prioritize them by their overall importance. So this is why you must sit together with your proper team, properly map out what asset you have, and properly give the priority to the asset. Which one you have the first priority to protect, and then second priority, and so on. Okay, so proper identification must be done in this very initial process. So in order to have a proper or clear picture of what asset that you want to prioritize, it is good to identify this information asset based on certain inventory and category. Okay, so this can include people, procedures, data, okay, networking element, hardware, software, and so on. Okay, so the first step, just like any brainstorming activity, no prejudging of value must be done in the very initial state. You just list out what asset you have, okay, and after that, only will you discuss, okay, this asset, okay, which category does it go to, okay, and then after that, after you categorize it, you properly give it priorities and perhaps grading. Okay, so value will be assigned later in the process later on. Okay, first of all, just list out whatever asset that you want to protect or deem worthy for your organization, and then list out those assets, categorize those assets. Okay, the rating and prioritizing comes later after you sit down together, see the whole picture, and then only you will give those asset priority. Okay, so this example in the diagram is just how you can categorize your asset and how does it include or relate to your organization. So perhaps you can have information system components, you can have categorize your asset according to the people category, procedures, data, software, hardware, and networking. So this list is usually unique to certain organization. So perhaps your organization have unique way of categorizing your asset. The most important thing is remember, list the asset first and then categorize, and then later on you give priority to those assets that you want to protect. Okay, so usually after categorizing those assets, you have risk management component. Okay, what will be the risk involved with the asset that you have identified? And then of course, the example of risk management component, perhaps you need to have proper employee, or you can have staff member with regard to the asset that you want to protect, and also what are the procedures, okay, what are the thing that is being done to the data, for example, transmission, processing, or storage. Okay, this can contribute to the risk perhaps. Perhaps during transmission, there will be some data leak that could happen, or perhaps you don't trust the people during the data transmission, for example, or perhaps during processing of data. Perhaps there will be a software or programming error that can also be listed later on. And of course, where do you want to actually store your data once you have done your business for the day? Okay, how frequent will you do the backup, for example? Where is the backup? Do you have proper backup or not? This you need to discuss with your team after you identify the asset, okay, and also the component that will be contributing to the risk for those assets. So in terms of creating an inventory of the information asset, either you can do it automatically or manually. Automatically means that sometimes certain organizations have already an inventory of asset that they have, and each of the asset that they buy, they have properly tagged those assets with the people that is actually going to use those assets, or perhaps the process with regard to those assets. So for that, it can be done automatically. But sometimes you don't have proper inventory of those assets, then you can do it manually. This is perhaps you can do it by visiting each department of your organization and properly do the inventory checking. Okay, so let's say you want to see, okay, this data, where does it come from? Who is actually handling it? So during asset identification, you probably do this exercise by visiting each and every corner of your organization to identify this asset. Where is your IP? Who is actually handling your IP, for example? So you have to do manual inventory checking if you don't have a proper automated inventory there in your organization. So how do you actually determine which attribute of each asset should be tracked? So this depends on the needs of the organization. For example, for each asset, why do you need that asset to begin with? What is it used for? What is the value? So how do you categorize your asset? Okay, is determined by your organization and how your organization value or use that asset. Okay, so this is very important in the very beginning. So an example, how do you do the inventory of asset? So you can have a proper documentation which have this information. So you can have the name of the asset, right? And the IP address of the asset, where is it located? And then perhaps you can include the MAC address or the asset type. Perhaps it's a software or hardware. Okay, and then the serial number, the manufacturer name, okay, the model, software version, for example, the physical location, logical location, and also the controlling entity. Controlling entity, perhaps who is responsible for the asset, okay, where is it located, who is actually managing it, how many users is using it, okay. So you need to have a proper documentation of your asset and any information which relate to that asset. So remember, this is the very beginning of your asset identification activity. So you just list out what asset or which asset that you deem worthy in your organization and what are the accompanying information with regard to that asset. So each organization have a unique way sometimes in identifying the asset and how to actually have information with regard to that asset. So you can use this guide in this page as perhaps a starting point to properly catalog your asset. On the other hand, in terms of identifying people, procedures, data, this is where the management and also the user comes in. Because in identifying proper manpower or human resource, this is the responsibility of the managers because only they know the proper workforce that is working for them, what is their responsibility, what is their role. So this identification should be recorded using a reliable data handling process like the one that you actually use for hardware and software. So perhaps you can use certain documentation collection, for example, who is the name of the employee, what is their responsibility, what are the software they are handling, for example, and which department are they actually working with, and what is their responsibility. So you need to also know who is in your organization that you deem you want to actually consider as the asset, and also each of these individual, what other information asset are they actually responsible for or with. So one final pointers in classifying and categorizing the asset. First of all, aside from those documentation of information in your sheet, for example, you need to determine whether the asset categories are actually meaningful. Remember, you have, first of all, identify the asset and you properly need to categorize those assets. So in categorizing those assets, find category which carries the most meaning. Okay, so inventory should reflect on each asset's sensitivity or the security priority. Means that, okay, you have perhaps the category is IP. So how many IP do you have in your organization? Okay, and then how many people you have. So for each of those people, what are their security clearance, for example? What sensitive data are they actually handling? Okay, so a classification of information asset is based on the sensitivity and security needs. And also, each category designate the level of protection needed. So perhaps you can give the priority. So this asset, priority level 1. This asset later on, priority level 2, and so on. So remember the activity now. You have asset identification. Secondly is the categorization of asset, and also the priority of those assets that you have identified. So these are just an example of the category of asset that you can have in your organization. So perhaps you can have the people category. So in this people category, perhaps you can have information such as the position, the supervisor's name, the security level clearance, and the special skills that the people has. Second category is the procedures. Perhaps you can have a description of the procedure, the purpose of the procedure, the software, hardware, and anything related to those procedure, and then the location. Where do you store the procedural information? And then the location, where is it stored for the update purpose? Okay, so procedures can be an example of how do you obtain, let's say, the purchase information. Okay, for the purchase information, what database will it use? Which website? Who is handling that website? So this is under the category of procedures. The third is classification of data. So this data can be user data, can be sensitive data, or your allowance information, for example, your vendor information. This can be under the category of data. So you have this information such as classification, the owner of those data, the size of the data structure that you have to store those data, the data structure used, is it an offline or online data, the location of the data, and the backup procedures related to that data. So this is just an example of how you categorize your information asset. So now that you have properly listed your asset, categorize your asset, the next activity in this risk management activity is, of course, assessing the value of each of the information asset that you identified and categorize. So for each of the assets that you identify, a relative value must be given. Okay, so perhaps for each of the people, each of the data, each of the procedures, what will be the value to your organization? Okay, so this relative value can be based on comparative judgment made to ensure that the most valuable information assets are given the highest priority. Okay, so perhaps in the previous example, you have category of people, category of procedures, category of data. So you give certain priority number for each of those category. And from those subcategory also give proper ranking to each of the information asset that you have identified. So how do you give the relative value? So how do you decide? You can base your decision to give the value based on this guideline. So first of all, which information asset is the most critical to the success of your organization? Okay, this is why you must sit together with the management and your team member in brainstorming this relative value. Okay, and then secondly, you can also consider which information asset generates the most revenue. This can also be a contributing factor. Third, which information asset generates the highest profitability? Again, in terms of monetary value, you need to decide and you need to identify it with the management. And then, which information asset is the most expensive to replace? Okay, what is value and how do you replace it if anything should happen? The next one is which information asset is the most expensive to protect? Okay, and then lastly, which information asset, if there's a loss or compromise, okay, will be the most embarrassing or cause the greatest liability? This can also be a contributing factor in determining the priority of the asset. Of course, each of these questions sometimes can be related or sometimes can be independent, okay, based on how you view your asset as a whole. So this is why you must have a proper team in assessing the asset and discuss from the very beginning of the exercise, okay, how do you value the asset and what does that asset bring to your organization. So you cannot make a very swift decision on this. You need to properly sit together, do this exercise properly, and discuss before you give certain priority to the asset that you want to protect. These are just the guideline that you can use to assessing the value of your asset. So this is just an example of the classification worksheet. If you notice, for this asset, they are used the impact to profitability. So for example, you have this set of asset, the data classification, you have the confidential information, private information, public information, for example. And then this is the impact to profitability. How does that organization value those assets in terms of what profit does it give to the organization? So for example, confidential document, okay, you have high impact to profitability. Perhaps it's really bring monetary value to the organization, this type of document. Okay, and then you have critical, you have medium, and also you have critical impact to profitability. How you give the ranking depends on how you want to give priority, and how you label the priority depends on your organization. This is just an example that you can use to give ranking and value to your asset that you want to protect. So lastly, after you have all those information, you have the asset, you have the category of asset, you have the proper ranking of those asset. So you list that asset in terms of order of importance. So after that activity, you can also see in your organization, this asset, how important is it to your organization? And which asset is actually less important and perhaps should not be the focus your attention in terms of perhaps giving certain budget to protect that asset. So the important thing from the outcome of the activity is to properly identify which asset is actually the most critical to your company and which must be protected at all costs from the very beginning of your exercise. This is very important if you have very limited budget or resources to protect the asset. Okay, so that's why this step is very much important from the very beginning. Okay, so you must have a proper factor analysis worksheet after you have done all those activities previously. Okay, so before we continue further, you can have a 5-minute break and then we continue with our next part of this chapter. The next step after properly identifying which asset do you want to protect is of course identifying the related threat that is actually would cause harm to the information asset that you actually deem worthy. So this is the activity where you call threat identification. So why this activity is very important? Because each threat actually present a certain unique challenge to information security. What control is suitable for each of the threat and who can actually be responsible for the threat that could happen. So after identifying the asset, you have to link each of the asset what could be the possible threat that could be fallen or could cause harm to the asset that you want to protect. So here you can see examples of possible threats with regard to information security. So for example, for the category of threat related to the human error or failure, it can be the threat of accident or employee mistakes. And also you can have threats such as compromises to intellectual property. So the threat can be piracy or copyright infringement, and then so on. So you can look these asset is just an example that you can use as a guideline to properly categorize the asset with regard to the information asset that you want to protect. So how do you assess each threat with regard to the information asset that you want to protect? So perhaps this guideline can be used when you want to assess which threat is actually need to be prioritized or deemed as causing most harm compared to other threats. So this question perhaps you need to ask during the brainstorming with your team. So you need to ask which threat present a danger to the organization information asset in its current environment. Means that with the current setting that you have, which threat present the most immediate danger? This is the first question that you must ask, and you must be honest to yourself, to your team, to your organization. Okay, don't be too bold, don't be too proud. Accept it as it is because you want to protect the asset. Okay, so you must properly assess your situation in this regard. Second question, which threat represent the serious danger to the organization's information asset? Okay, which of the assets that you have listed causes the most danger? Third, okay, which threat have the highest probability of success? Okay, you can have many threats that you have listed, but which threat actually has the highest probability to succeed if it should happen? The fourth question, which threat could result in the greatest loss for the organization if successful? Okay, and which threat, okay, is the organization least prepared to handle? Do you have the proper manpower to handle the threat if it fallen into your information asset? Do you have the proper mechanism to protect your asset against that threat or not? Okay, which threat costs the most to protect against? If you want to protect the asset against this threat, what would it cost to your organization? And is it worth the protection cost or not? And which threat costs the most to recover from? So let's say the threat of ransomware happening. Okay, you cannot get access to your information asset. What would it cost to recover from such incident, for example? So ask yourself, ask your team, get an honest answer, then you can properly give priority to the threat that could happen to your information asset that you want to protect. So these questions can be used as guideline when you are assessing each threat with regard to the information asset that you have listed previously. So this is an example of a response in terms of percentage after you properly assess with your team in terms of probability or the occurrences of those threats. So for example, probability of occurrence, okay, you give it a rating of 85.4%. The reputation loss, if successful, is 77%. Okay, and then the cost to protect, 64%. Okay, frequency of attack, perhaps 52%, and none of this, perhaps 6.3%. Okay, so you can assess each threat, ask those questions, give it a certain number or value. Okay, so perhaps you can have a vote, for example, or you can have a proper calculation depending how you actually try to value or give certain quantifying meaning to your assessment. Okay, the most important thing is discuss with your group, be as honest as possible, because if anything is actually causing harm to your information asset and you are too proud to admit it, then in the long run it will not be very good to your organization. Okay, the most important thing from this activity is to identify the threat with regard to the information asset that you want to protect. Okay, you must be realistic, you must be very honest to yourself, because this is very important in determining the security control to protect those assets from those threats. So if you're not being honest, then you cannot have a proper security control to protect your asset. So just like you are assessing the value of your asset, the next one is prioritizing the level of threat that you have identified. Okay, so you have categorized your asset. Now you need to give categories to the threat. Okay, so this category depends again on your organization. You can either use industry standard or you can use your organization standard, depending how you want to categorize the threat that could actually cause harm to the threat and to the information asset of your organization. Now, this is just an example how you can give ranking to the threat that you have identified. Okay, so for example, you can have the threat level based on color or based on number. So for example, white level threat, okay, perhaps this is a very lowest threat with regard to the asset that you want to protect. And then you can have green level or level 1, medium level, high level, or very high or severe level. Okay, so depends. Sometimes you can just have 3 level of threat, or you can have just 2 level, okay, very mild or perhaps very high. It depends on, again, your organization. So how you give the threat level depend and unique to your own organization. So you need to have a proper ranking of threat with regard perhaps to the value of loss that could happen, or perhaps the value that you have to recover if the threat should actually happen. So ask again the question from the previous page, and perhaps you can use this question to give the proper ranking to the threat that could cause harm to your information asset. Now, after listing the asset that you want to protect, given it priority, and the next one is prioritizing the threat that could cause harm to the asset that you have listed. The next one is identify the vulnerability that could contribute to the success of the threat that you have identified earlier. Okay, so in terms of succession, you identify the asset first, then the list of threat that could cause harm to the asset, and then the list of vulnerability or weakness of the asset that could actually assist or elevate the threat that you have identified earlier. Alright, for example, I give you, okay, you have your asset, which is perhaps you have keep a file in a room. Okay, so with regard to that, the threat could be the theft of those documents inside the room. The vulnerability that could contribute to the success rate of the threat is perhaps you have a very weak door. Okay, can you see the relationship between the asset, threat, and the vulnerability there? Okay, the asset is a document inside the room. The threat is the theft. The vulnerability is the weak door. Okay, another example could be still the document is the asset. The threat could be fire, causing the loss of the document. The vulnerability could be the room is very prone to fire. It's not fireproof. So that can be the relationship between the asset, threat, and vulnerability. Okay, so that's why in terms of succession, first of all, identify the threat. After you properly identify and categorize the threat, next is identify the related. Let's identify the threat related to the asset. So asset, threat, and the vulnerability. The vulnerability could be a pull factor to why threat can be successful in harming the asset. Okay, so now you have a full circle of the risk assessment activity. So you identify the asset, identify the related threat, and identify the vulnerability with regard to the threat. So these are examples that perhaps you can use in terms of relating the threat and example of vulnerabilities with each of the threat listed in this page. Okay, so example, you have the threat of human error or failure. So the possible vulnerability that could contribute to the threat is, of course, you can see here, the employees or contractors may cause an outage if configuration errors are made. So these are possible vulnerabilities that could contribute to the threat being successful. Other example can be forces of nature here. For the vulnerabilities can be all information assets in the organization are subject to forces of nature. For example, it's very weak, or perhaps if rain should happen and fallen into the asset, then perhaps you have a document loss, for example, or perhaps there is thunderstorm, it causes fire, then perhaps that document can be lost in the fire. So these are just examples of possible vulnerabilities that can actually elevate the possibility of the threat being successful. So you can also list this after you properly list your asset, list the possible threat, list the related vulnerabilities that could cause or add the success factor to the threat happening. So at the end of the risk assessment activity, this is the document that you need to actually produce. So remember previously you have listed the priority of asset to your organization. With each of the categorized and prioritized asset, you need to have a proper threat, okay, that you have identified, and the level of threat with regard to the asset in terms of which threat actually causes more harm to the asset compared to others. And then lastly, the list of related vulnerability that could contribute to the success factor of the threat harming the asset. So this is the objective of the TVA worksheet. Okay, you have the threat, vulnerability, and asset worksheet. Okay, which is the name TVA, the TVA worksheet. So basically, this is in a nutshell, okay, contains all the information with regard to the asset, the related threat, and the related vulnerability, okay, that you need to actually look at as a whole in order to assess the next step. Meaning, from the TVA worksheet, you can properly assess, okay, from this threat and vulnerability, what should be the next risk control activity or security control that you can implement to protect your asset. So this is an example of the TVA worksheet. So you have the list of asset, and for each of the asset, there can be a list of threat, and then the priority of control given to the asset. So from this, you can properly see, perhaps in a very, from the outlook of the organization. So for each of the asset, which is causing more harm to the asset that you have listed. So basically, you have the threat information, you have the asset information, and the priority of controls that you can implement to protect the asset. So from this activity of this assessment, lastly, is the activity of identifying possible control that could protect your information asset against those threats and perhaps patching certain vulnerabilities. Okay, so how you can actually give control to protect the asset can be categorized into three. So I have covered this before. So basically, you can have perhaps in terms of having proper policy to protect the asset, or having a proper program to protect the asset and also vulnerability, and also lastly, have actual technical control to protect the asset against the threat that you have identified. Okay, so in terms of vulnerability, perhaps you can patch certain weaknesses in the system to enhance the security of the asset against the threat. So it can work together, either you have policies, program, and technical control all together to protect the asset. It all depends on how you prioritize and how you see those assets in terms of how many resources do you have in terms of protecting the asset based on the threat and vulnerability that you have identified. Again, it involves your team. Okay, you have to involve the management, you have to involve the IT team, you have to involve the security team from the very beginning until the very end of the risk management process. So at the end of the day, what can you gain from this activity? Of course, the first thing that you must remember is the goal of the risk management process is to identify information asset and their vulnerability, meaning you must be honest. Each of those assets, they have weaknesses, and each of those weaknesses contribute to certain threat that could happen. Okay, so this must be properly reflected in your TVA worksheet, and then properly rank them to the importance and value to your organization. Which asset need more protection? Which asset perhaps needs proper consideration in terms of having a very good control over it. So from your activity of prioritizing the asset, identifying the threat, and identifying the vulnerability, you can have a proper roadmap of which asset is very important to you, which asset must be given proper focus from the very beginning. Again, if you have a very limited resources, this exercise is very important because you can prioritize which one can you focus on first and foremost. Okay, and of course, in preparing this list, organizations should have obtained at the very end a very thorough roadmap of what you have, what could cause harm, and what is the weakness that you must address. Secondly, information about the control that is already in place for each of these assets. Okay, what do we have currently in order to protect it, and can those controls be improved or can be enhanced further? And lastly, the final summarized document, the rank vulnerability risk worksheet, mean that for each of the asset, threat, and vulnerability, you give it a proper ranking so you can actually be sure for each of the control that you want to implement. Okay, you decide those decisions based on the proper discussion and mapping that you have done in the risk assessment process. So when you want to actually get certain funding or resources from your management, then you can justify based on this activity, okay, this will be the list of assets that you deem perhaps needed attention the most, and these are the threats that could come to the asset that you want to protect the most. Okay, so the most important thing from this exercise is you have a very factual representation of the information asset that you want to protect and why you want to protect it. So any documentation that you want to produce or keep from the risk assessment exercise, you must actually package the output of the either ranking or details of the asset, threat, and vulnerability that you have collected. You must ask yourself how you are actually going to package the information that you already have. Okay, so you should ask from your team, okay, what should the documentation package look like? What actually information do you want to highlight to the management? For example, if you in terms of you want to get certain funding or certain resources in terms of protecting your asset, and then what are the deliverables from this stage of risk management process? What do you want to deliver from this exercise? Do you want to actually identify the priority of asset, or do you want to actually identify which vulnerability must be addressed in terms of giving priority and to get immediate funding, for example? What will be your deliverable? What you want to actually project to the management? Okay, so basically the risk identification process should designate, first of all, from the report, what function of the report must it serve? Why do you want to have the report in the first place? Secondly, who is responsible for preparing the report? Who will be involved in your team from the very beginning? Okay, from the management, who will be the people? From the IT side, who will be the people? from the information security team, who will be the people. Identify it properly, because each of those identification process must have this group working together. So you must decide how do you do the proper sentencing, the wording to deliver to the correct people to get the correct response and feedback. Okay, and lastly, who will review them? From the thing that you have actually compiled together, who will actually do the proofreading and who will actually deliver it to the management next, if the focus is to get the funding from the management. So depending on who will have or who will be the response or the target of your document and what is the purpose of the document or risk management or risk assessment process in the first place. Okay, so your documentation must be tailor-made according to this designation. Okay, the purpose, the function, and the people that will use the document. So as a general guideline, so the information asset classification worksheet, the purpose is to assemble information about information asset that you want or you actually prioritizing in your organization. Secondly, the weighted criteria analysis worksheet. So you want to assign a rank value of your asset with regard to each of the asset that you have identified. And then the TVA worksheet, you want to combine the output from all the asset, threat, and vulnerability that you have identified. And then the rank vulnerability, you want to assign certain value to the vulnerability that you identify in the contributing of the success to the threat. Okay, so you can either have a separate vulnerability risk worksheet or you can have a overall TVA worksheet. Okay, again, depending on the purpose why you do the analysis, why you do the identification, who will actually view your end result from this exercise. Okay, so basically that sums up what we need to cover in this chapter of risk management. So basically you need to identify what are the activities involved in risk management. Secondly, what you need to do in risk identification, basically it involves the asset, threat, and vulnerability identification. Give it proper ranking, give it a proper valuation, so you can have an overall value or overall insight of what need to be done with regard to protecting your information asset. And lastly, how do you actually document the result from the risk assessment exercise? So again, with regard to who will view it, what is the purpose of you doing the documentation in the first place? How are you going to tailor-make the information that you have in perhaps getting funding or perhaps a support for the security control that you want to have to protect your information asset from this exercise. Okay, so I think that's all for this chapter, and I hope it will benefit you in the long run when you are actually working in the field later on. So thank you for joining. So I hope I can see you again in the next session. Thank you.